The book, the Ramlila at Ramnagar, it's called The Actors, Pilgrims, Kings and Gods, the Ramlila at Ramnagar, is based on research on a performance that happens every year of the Ramlila in a town called Ramnagar, which is across the Ganga from Banaras. And the initial interest began for me to study this form was because it was a form that crossed many boundaries. It was not theatre, it was not religion, it was not performance, it was also performance. So how does one categorize, or do we forget whether we categorize or not forms like these? And what is extraordinary is, and which is why the energy of the form for me was very important, was the fact that great part of the form was actually made by the spectators. The Ramlila, as we all know, the way it functions in the in Uttar Pradesh and in North India, is a performance usually of 10 days, usually done by amateurs, and lasting from, let us say, the main events of the Ramayana, the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsi. The Banaras Ramlila is particularly, the Ramnagar Ramlila is particularly interesting because it begins before the birth of Ram and runs 31 days in a small town, in actually a sort of village, where the map of the village, or the map of the actual map of the space, becomes a space for the metaphor, becomes metaphorized, as it were. So all the rivers and the forests and the gazebos and the palaces are actual spaces of the town. So, you know, there's another bit of contradiction and another bit of interesting changeover. Are we in sacred space, or are we in everyday space that becomes sacred? So all these changes that this Ramlila allows us to experience was wonderful. And the other part, of course, is that the actors playing Ram, Lakshman, Sita, and Bharat and Akul and Sahadev are pre-puberty boys. There are no girls and no children there. And they are trained into the Ramlila for about a month. But then during the course of the Ramlila, they're treated like gods. They're called Swaroop, coming from the word Roop. And they are treated like the gods. And what is extraordinary is that the energy of the audience, which could range anything from 10,000 to 25,000 a day, is actually what creates the let's say, making of the god. And it is something that made me feel very excited about the fact that the actual theatre performance is made as much by the actors as it is made by the audience. And then, just on the thought of the audience, which is something that we anybody who goes as an audience experiences, you know, you're never near enough to hear the words, and sometimes you're too far to see the visual. So why are you there? So you're there because of their kind of atmosphere. You always hear the singing if you're if you sit near the singer. So you have a kind of choice. It's promenade. You want to hear the actors, you go near the space. You want to hear the singers, you go to the edge of the space. You want to read your Ramayana while you're the Ramcharitmanas while you're watching it. You can be anywhere. So it's a sort of flux and a chaos, which is what drew me in the first place, and which made and I returned several times to Banaras to research it. So in some senses, the excitement is that there is no particular boundary, no particular category to look at it. So there's no particular author either. If there is an author, it's probably the audience. So it's a new experience for theatre performance. And I think even when I go now, every time it energizes me, because, you know, you begin to think of theatre as a more wide-based democratic form, not led by hierarchies of, you know, how should I put it? Neither the word, nor the visual, nor the music, but all together, things actually come to you as an experience. So this has been the interest that has led me to this form, and this is also the interest that leads me many times to look at pre-modern theatre forms, which can lead you to questioning the kinds of categories that we sometimes now make. I try to explore it from the lens of the theatre, in the sense that we know that the Ramcharitmanas is treated like a religious text. We know that the figure of Ram has mobilized many kinds of religious fervor. What's interesting in the Ramlila, the Leela at Ramnagar, is that it doesn't mobilize any of that. And wherever you might find a space becomes a sacred space. Once the actual set is removed, the set could just be a platform or two platforms. It goes back into everyday life. So the distinction between the sacred and the profane, between the everyday and the ordinary, is a very, very, as I said earlier, very porous. So you can't simply call it performance of the Leela, you can't simply call it religion, because whereas the boys are treated while they are playing Ram and Lakshman as gods, but in the middle they'll have a conversation with you, they'll sometimes doze off, they'll sometimes be chewing supari. Where do you place this experience? And I think this non-placement is something that is of interest, because it is not an orthodoxy. And I think that's why I say quite, I say with some passion that it's not about a religious authorship at all in the way that it runs. I am absolutely, because I think that the boundary is porous between Mela and performance and Durga Puja. The Durga Puja has as much to do with the pandal as to do with the Durga inside. So I think these porous boundaries are very important. I think it's particularly important in the Ramlila because it can tend to become, at least after the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, it could have become more orthodox, but it didn't. And I think what's also interesting is that the Ram image there is the Ram more of, let us say, Bhavbhuti, and he's a boy. He's got none of the muscular energy of the kind of Ram summoned through the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, for instance. And I think these kinds of narratives that in some senses run counter to sort of hegemonic narratives are quite an interesting aspect. But you're absolutely right. I think there are many forms that are porous and are interesting because they're porous, I think.